You're listening to Pushing the Envelope, Life at the Cutting Edge of Customs Innovation. I'm Tom Muller with the Cross Border Research Association. On this show, we explore the frontiers of customs creativity in conversations with customs and logistics experts, technology innovators, research scientists, and other leaders in the field. Industry insiders call this show the Pencast because it's part of PenCP, a network for boosting customs innovation funded by the European Union under the Horizon 2020 program. Today, I'm very honored to be speaking with Mr. Tony Smith, CBE, whose distinguished career in customs and border security has spanned 5 decades. He served as Director General of the UK Border Force, the head of the borders in both the UK and Canada, and the Gold Commander for the UK Border Agency during the 2012 Olympic Games in London, for which service he was appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire the following year. I'll stop the honor roll there, but there's considerably more to Tony's resume that we'll get to during our talk. Hello, Tony, and welcome to Pushing the Envelope.
Hello.
I usually start these conversations off by asking, what brought my interviewees to customs work in the first place. And in your case, while preparing for this interview, I read your memoirs, Changing Borders, A Kingdom Unlocked, which I strongly recommend to all our listeners as a very informative and entertaining read. And there's a classic scene of your first interview with immigration back in 1972 in Adelaide House in London. Could you describe that moment and how you kicked off your career?
Yeah, sure. Well, back in the day, in the 70s, I was one of those people that chose not to go on to university. Not everybody did then. People left education. We had O-levels and A-levels, and people left education and went straight into the workplace. And so I did, aged 18, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do, other than get a job and, start raising some money. And I did have, some O-levels and A-levels, some educational qualifications at least. And so I was encouraged by my careers master at school to look at the civil service, which is basically UK government. I didn't want to join the police. I've got a lot of relatives in the police, and I thought I don't really want to do that. I'll buck the trend. I'll have a look around. And so I put down on my form customs and home office. And eventually they sent me a letter to go and see somebody in central London at London Bridge to talk about becoming an immigration officer, not a customs officer, an immigration officer. And that was quite daunting, really, because I had no idea what I was going into. And I was given as a sort of a teenager some very stark realities of life on the border, such as, you don't assume that you can carry on living in London. Don't assume that you can carry on working 9 to 5 and have your weekends free. In fact, don't assume any of those things, because actually we could post you anywhere to any port of entry in the UK, and you might find yourself even out on the sea doing checks. And I had these sort of visions of being stuck in Belfast in the middle of the night, crawling around under lorries. When there was a young sort of lad from West London, I had my routine. I had my football team and see my girlfriend and all those kind of things. And so that really sort of scared me off a bit. So I actually turned down the job to start off with and said, no, I don't really think that's for me, and I'd rather just have an office job. So they put me in the Home Office dealing with applications from foreign nationals to stay in the UK, which was an office job behind a desk, dealing with paper applications, weren't any computers in those days, and writing to people and getting evidence and just making decisions. And it wasn't very long before I ran into some immigration officers and some customs officers who said you'd made a really big mistake. It's not as you were told. You certainly won't be going to Belfast or anywhere out of London, because we need the people in London, really. And actually, you'll probably find yourself at Heathrow, and so it came to pass. So I don't, for anyone that's thinking of a career in future, sometimes, you should research these things, of course. But for me, I just drifted into it, and I just fell in love with it. And I say, I did 40 years working for the government, 10 years now since I retired from government, still in the border security business. So it's probably either for you or it isn't, but don't assume that your life is completely mapped out, or you can map it out in advance. You never quite know what's going to happen to you, in my experience anyway.
Yeah, and at 18, you can't be expected to fully understand where you're headed or what's going to be best. But you certainly, and some of the best things in life happen almost by accident, or seem to be by accident. But you certainly landed yourself in one of the most dynamic, fast-moving, and critical areas of public service.
Yes, yeah, I certainly did.
to a fault sometimes. We'll get into some of the more challenging moments in your career.
Yeah.
You are, I believe, the only person to rise through all the ranks from immigration officer, as you started off, to Director General of the UK Border Force. And some of the officers I consulted in preparation for this conversation remember very positively your stalwart support of the Queen's Park Rangers Football Club and of the London band Chaz and Dave, not to mention the occasional beer it had with them down at the pub. How did your extensive experience in the field help you to understand the frontline challenges of customs and immigration work?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think that won't happen again. You're right. I did stay in the Home Office my entire career. I had a 3-year exchange attachment in Ottawa with the Canadian immigration. But, yeah, I mean, essentially, it's unusual now for civil servants, I think, anywhere really, to stay in the same, well, even to stay within government for 40 years, let alone to stay within the same department. So I kind of bucked the trend. But back in those days, there was a sort of a progression ladder that you followed. And, you know, you would be expected to do quite a lot of time on the front line before you got promoted. That was the sort of culture in those days. And there was quite a lot you could do on the front line. And so I wasn't actually a customs officer. I was an immigration officer. And that meant that I could, so I was dealing with people rather than goods. But I mean, it meant that there were opportunities for me at the basic grade to do different things. So, you know, I did say, so I started at the airport at Heathrow on the front line, checking passports and, you know, identifying whether people should be admitted to the country or not. And then after a few years of that, you get the opportunity to go and work at other ports of entry. So I went to the seaports and learned how to deal with different type of traffic, with container traffic and ferry traffic. And then I was given the opportunity to serve overseas in a visa mission. So I went to Dhaka in Bangladesh, where I started considering visa applications and how people get, you know, permissions to come to the country in the first place before they get to Heathrow. And then I went into immigration enforcement about, well, what about people that have got through the border but shouldn't be staying in the country? What do we do with them? How do we catch them and deport them if they shouldn't be here? So it took me about 10, 11, 12 years to sort of get what you call a sort of full flush of all of the pre-entry, on-entry and after-entry capabilities within the department. So I was a pretty rounded individual, at least in that sphere of life, when I got my promotion to Chief Immigration Officer after about 10 years. And that was not unusual. That was quite fast even then. Many people then stayed as immigration officers their whole careers, really, on the front line at the border. But that's not so much the case these days, but it certainly was then. And then I think, again, you know, when I got Chief Immigration Officer, I started to get into some of the work at headquarters, some of the more policy work we were doing, moved between ports of entry and enforcement and policy, and started getting involved in some of the international stuff. And I can remember coming over to the US southern border. I was selected under a middle management program. I think it was about 91, something like that, where a person from each of the 4 countries, it was the 4 country conferences then, it was so US, Canada, Australia and the UK, picked a person who they thought might be, you know, material to float up to the top of the office, and decided to put a sort of program where we would go around and look and see how different countries did this. And that was really, I think that was a big landmark for me, coming over to have a look at what was going on down on the US southern border. We don't have a land border in the UK as such. You know, the irregular migrants coming through the fences, all that kind of stuff. Some of the work that the US was doing on immigration. And I was fascinated by the comparisons, if you like, between the way different countries manage their borders and how different countries respond to international events. And I think that's what really interested me. And that's what led ultimately to my posting to Canada. An opportunity came up for a posting to be the Director of Ports of Entry in Canada. that was still immigration, because in those days, immigration and customs were separate. Many countries now have a united border force, including the US, Canada, UK, Australia, have all merged immigration and customs. But prior to that, there were separate departments dealing with people and goods. And I was on the people side, and the opportunity came up to go to Canada as a director of ports of entry, and blow me down, no sooner did I get in this job and 9/11 happened. So there was this sort of British guy thrust into the heart of the border security agenda for North America, shuttling between Ottawa and Washington, D.C., trying to figure out how can we improve border security for the South, for North America, whilst at the same time getting the border open again, because it was shut, and lots and lots of people couldn't get across to go to work or school. It was a really sort of one of those watershed moments in my life, I think, where I suddenly looked around me and it was me. Really, people were asking me what we should do rather than me doing what I was told. And that was really quite enlightening. And of course, then I brought that back with me when I finished my tour of duty in Canada between 2000 and 2003, and blow me down, I then get appointed Director of Ports of Entry in London for the UK border, and 7/7 happened. So I was in a pretty strong sort of leadership position in probably two of the most biggest terrorist attacks we've ever known, in the West, certainly in the US 9/11 and UK 7/7, which was the attack on our metro system. And all of that sort of knowledge and experience and trauma, if you like, of going through that chaos, I think just sort of welded me to a position as, look, this is probably, if I'm going to make my life around as being an expert in something, it's probably border security, because I've kind of lived through a couple of pretty challenging events in two different countries. And I think that's why they appointed me as the goal commander for the London 2012 Olympics, because we were operating, I mean, the Olympics over the years has always been subject to security measures and terrorist attack. And the risk level here in the UK for London 2012 was high, it was severe. A terrorist attack was highly likely. And that meant that I had to do everything that I could to ensure the safety of the games and the safety of my country. Not just me, of course. I mean, I had the border bits of this and the accreditation, but there were lots of other people in the police and in the military and in the security services I worked with closely as a team. That was probably the most exhilarating part of my career, working on that program, doing something really, really valuable for your people and your country. It's a great thing to host an Olympic Games, but the last thing you want is people disrupting it. You want everybody to have a good time and everybody seeing who's winning the gold medals and not worrying about what's happening in the streets around London or at the ports of entry or elsewhere. So I guess that's sort of in a nutshell how I sort of climbed the slippery pole, is that I think I probably, made it up sort of mid-level management and then spread my wings, looked outward, overseas and around to see and came back with quite a lot of experience about how and I've kept that going ever since, really. That's why I now run IBMATA. I chair conferences all around the world. It's something that's almost in my DNA, I suppose, although life's moved on a lot now, of course, and there's a lot more technology and, geopolitical environment in many countries has changed a lot over the years. There are some pretty fundamental things that stick with you, some basic principles about border management that still fascinate me even to this day after 50 years in the business. So, I think that's what prompted me to write my book as much as everything else. I ought to write this down because, well, if I don't, then people will never know about some of the things that happened back then. So, hopefully in years to come, it'll be on the shelves of some border students as a history, history of some of the developments of international borders over that time. Although it was, I must admit, a bit self-indulgent. It was a very personal account. It was my story about me, not just about, an academic study of borders. That's what a lot of editors wanted me to write something like that. But I just wanted to tell my story, really, and I'm glad I did.
Well, I mean, there are plenty of academics who can write an academic study of borders. You are living in the front line. As you say, you went through multiple trials by fire, and you learned from that experience and the combination of your background. I'm fascinated to hear that your formative 10, 12 years was then taken to the next level by travel, by going outside, by exploring other, ways in which countries manage borders and respond to events. Just in a nutshell, what were your first impressions in Canada and the U.S. southern border? What were the different ways in which they managed borders and responded to events that you hadn't seen before in the U.K.?
Well, I think certainly in Canada, what struck me was their approach to immigration. In fact, the first person you saw back then was a customs officer. When you arrived at the port of entry in Canada, not an immigration officer, which is what I've been doing for the last 10 years. Customs in the UK were downstairs. You went and picked your bags up first before you came to a customs officer, and there were sort of red and green channels, which, you self-declared, if you like, if you were over the limit, if you wanted goods to declare, and so customs were sort of after passport control. In Canada, it was the reverse. So, and then that got me thinking about why is that so? And it was clearly the Canadians in those days. It was Canada Customs and Revenue Agency. They weren't too worried about immigration, really. They got a big country, and they were spent a lot of their world looking to scouring the world to bring people into Canada. Whereas we never really did that here in the UK. And so I think the main benefit of having customs at primary and speaking to every passenger, particularly on the transborder flights from the States, was revenue. It was the Canada Customs and Revenue Agency. And, so if you'd been down to America shopping and you were coming back up again, well, how much have you bought and how much can we tax you? So revenue collection prior to 9/11 was made. They're probably their main priority at the Canadian border anyway. And the thinking was, well, if anybody's coming up from the States, the US have probably already checked them out. And, they're third country nationals. They should be pretty safe coming up here. And of course, 9/11 completely changed that landscape. And I can remember the first few days after 9/11 where many in the US administration at the time pointed the finger at Canada. Publicly and said, before the facts emerged, well, these people must have been hiding in the woods in Montreal or something, and they've come down and blown us up because we know what Canada's like. It's got a very soft border. They let everybody in there. They haven't really got, they're only really interested in raising revenue from travellers, whereas, of course, the US were in a very difficult position after 9/11 when it emerged that in fact they had granted permissions to all of the terrorists to enter through the visa system, and then the rest is history, But I think that sort of different dynamic about what are you doing at your border? Why have you got a border? What is your primary purpose? Is it revenue collection? Is it security? Is it immigration control? I learned quite quickly that varies to a great extent in different countries, and that varies a lot in response to events, be they political events like, we've had Brexit here, where regulations change, or be they, terrorist events, or different dynamics, really. Some of the pressures, you see in America now on the southern border are far greater than they were back then. And it was seen as a problem back then. So I think politics absolutely pervades border, and new governments come in with a different approach. And we're seeing that all over the world now, that new governments are coming in, and the jury is out really on whether or not we should have a tougher border, a harder border, a softer border, or a border at all between countries. And if in other words, is there a common thread, if you like, everywhere in the world about what you're trying to do at your border, whether that's in customs or in immigration or in policing? What is the purpose of the border? And that is very much driven by the political agenda of the government of the day. And so I've written innumerable border strategies for different countries, and they will be kicked around, and the tone will change depending upon the mood music of the elected government. We're tough on borders, we're tough on security, we're tough on immigration, or we're more liberal in our approach. So you have to continually update, if you like, or upgrade your strategy in line with world events. And that's, I suppose, my biggest learning point of all, in the international domain is that things change all of the time. Nothing stays the same in borders. And that's why I'm so pleased to be able to still be in the game, really. And I learn something, 50 years in the business, everywhere I go, I learn something new. Whenever I go to a conference, I learn something new about what's going on in the wonderful world of immigration, customs and borders. And it's a hobby as much as a profession, really, for me.
Well, that's a wonderful thing to be able to bring the two together, the passion and the professionalism and the experience. Now, you're mentioning the nature of a border is largely driven by politics. The merging, you've stressed immigration on the one hand, where you joined this world, and customs being two separate bodies, people and goods, and then being combined in global border forces. Is that also a political decision? And is that always the appropriate thing to combine those forces?
It's not always the appropriate thing. People assume that there is a sort of a perfect model, but I don't think there is. I mean, I think there are a set of principles at play, really, about how you construct your agencies around the border. The merger of customs and immigration all began in the US after 9/11, frankly. Because actually it was the US customs who had the data on the flights. It wasn't immigration, because immigration were only dealing with international flights, and these attacks were on domestic flights. So, I mean, I didn't know at the time, but actually the reason that US customs were able to link up and, all of the hijackers in a day was because they were getting passenger data as well as goods data on internal domestic US flights, which INS, the immigration system, weren't. And of course it was the INS that had granted visas to the attackers without any knowledge of customs or anybody else. They were poles apart in terms of working together. And I mean, if you read the 9/11 report, and I'm sure you have, and I strongly recommend that to anybody who's got a real interest in border security. It's very revealing about how things worked back then, but it was very, very badly stovepiped. So whatever way you dressed it up, there was clearly a need for much, much better collaboration between different departments and agencies with an interest in the border. And I think that because INS had really, I think they took the rap, if you like, because of the visa thing, that the INS pretty well folded up, and it was US Customs that came to the fore. But many US Customs officers at that time had very little experience with passports or visas or people management. And I can remember myself when I tried to, I was told, get down to Washington and talk to these guys in, Ronald Reagan building about what's going on and what's happening. I had a job getting into America from Canada because, of course, I had a British passport, and they'd never seen a British passport, hardly ever. And of course, when I told them my story, that actually I was a director of ports of entry in Canada, and I was coming to work with them, then that didn't go down too well with the first couple of customs officers I ran to, put me into secondary and started phoning people up to check I was who I said I was. And
that's fascinating. Unexpected collateral damage there. That's amazing. Yeah,
so they put customs on the border very quickly in the US, and then I think it became clear as the 9/11 inquiry unfolded and what had happened that there was a key issue of collaboration between customs officers and immigration officers and police officers in a border environment. And actually, do you really need different departments? I mean, it's bad people that bring bad stuff after all. And, dividing it on people and stuff, is that a good way of doing it? Maybe not. And so I think it was the US that started the first idea of creating, US Customs and Border Protection. And then the Canadians followed shortly after I left there. They saw what was happening in the States and said, well, if America sneezes, then Canada catches the flu. And really, we ought to follow suit. So they created the Canada Border Services Agency, which was a mixture. We did that here. I lived through that when we created the UK Border Force or the UK Border Aid. We merged immigration and customs. But, prior to that, my knowledge of customs was pretty ropey. I mean, even when I got to the top job, I really struggled with some of the customs requirements, revenue raising requirements. I can remember when I got the top job, the Director General of the Border Force, my boss was Theresa May, who was the Home Secretary. And she was responsible for immigration and security and policing and all the rest of it. But she had no interest in customs and revenue. That was the Chancellor. That was a chap called George Osborne. And, when I opened my first sort of intro, when I got the top job, I had a letter from George Osborne formally appointing me as the collector of all revenues at the UK border, which sort of scared me a bit because I had no idea.
That's not the job you signed up for. Yeah.
No, I very quickly had a very steep learning curve about what we did, because because the policy in the UK, the policy in the UK on revenue collection still rests with HMRC. The policy on standards of foodstuffs and, other goods and pharmaceuticals rests with the Department of, Rural Affairs and Health. And you soon come to realize when you're running a border that you've got lots and lots of masters in lots and lots of different departments. And though you can't, as I did for a lot of my career, assume that you stay within your one department, you then have to start feeding a lot of other masters who are all asking you to do things, who may have different priorities. And those priorities may change from, security to regulation to revenue collection to healthcare. Look at COVID and what happened at the borders around the world then. These are the things that really torment you when you're trying to set a long-term strategy for a border, is that you never quite know what's around the next corner. And before you know it, anything you've done before, forget about all that stuff. You will now walk towards this particular problem. So, and I think that's the case for most countries. So some countries will say to you, no, I'm not going to merge custom. Look to Europe. Very few European countries have got an integrated customs and borders. They've usually got immigration and police and security services working in different formats. I think the key to it, what we promote through IBMATA, is collaboration. I think however you structure things, however you build your house, I think you need to make sure there are plenty of open doorways between the agencies so they do collaborate and work together and share data and share information. And then you don't need necessarily to merge your departments into one great big, behemoth of officials to enable you to do that. In fact, it might be counterproductive, because there are niche expertise areas in customs and in health and in, agriculture and in security and in immigration, that there's a danger you become a jack of all trades and a master of none, as they say. So I would always want to have a very, very close look at a country before I made any recommendations as to whether or not they should restructure their departments or agencies around their border. I would really want to know first and foremost what their priorities are and what their primary concerns are, and then take it from there.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that really does depend again on the environment, probably the geography to a certain extent of the, because you've done consulting for a number of different governments, national governments on this very project, and so on this same set of questions. So you have really looked at that, answered that question time and time again, and it's fascinating to hear that there is no one good answer, and that specialization on the one hand and collaboration on the other need to coexist, rather than just, as you say, merging into one shapeless bureaucratic mass that often is the worst of both worlds. So you've mentioned your role as the Gold Commander for Borders during the 2012 Olympics, for which you received a CVE from the Queen. Frequently there's a discussion in conventional customs and immigration of the need to balance security on the one hand with speed and efficiency on the other. Were you facing the same balance in 2012, and was this the perfect storm of challenges that you had to sort of keep in balance?
Absolutely. In fact, what it does is it sharpens the focus upon that requirement, because, we lived through, on my watch, two of the busiest days Heathrow Airport has ever seen. The opening ceremony, And I think the first weekend they received more arrivals at Heathrow, which was the Olympic port, than they'd ever received in history. And I think they've struggled to beat it since then because everybody arrives at the same time. And of course, sprinkled amongst that, you had a lot of VIPs, presidents, prime ministers, ministers coming from all over the world around about the same time, bringing their entourage. Some of them wanted to bring guns.
Yikes.
Some of them wanted special treatment over others. All of that stuff hits you very hard, and so you have to plan for that. And the other thing about the Olympics is that there is a system called accreditation, which means that you can get a pass, if you like, an accreditation card, which would enable you, if you're a non-national, to get into the country in the first place. So you have to show it at the border. But that also gives you access to the venues, and sometimes quite sensitive areas of the venue. And they put me in charge of accreditation for my sins. I mean, there was a debate that shouldn't necessarily be the border force that did that, because a lot of the people coming to the games were British people. So that's just more of a policing security issue. But in the end, they said, well, the only agency we've got that's got a comprehensive watch list, if you like, of foreigners and British people who might be mischievous is you. You've got that. So I was absolutely biting my nails on having responsibility for accreditation. I had to go to meetings with, on the one hand, Princess Anne, and Seb Coe, and the IOC. And you have to, when you bid for an Olympic Games, you have to agree to certain preconditions with the IOC, is that you won't have long queues at your border. And accreditation will be a fairly simple process, and that you're not going to be able to ask for all of the data you might want from applicants for accreditation. You will get these basic data elements, which are broadly the passport data elements. And after that, and actually, we'd rather you didn't refuse anyone accreditation because it doesn't look good for the Olympics. Whereas when you come back to the ranch and you look at it through the lens of security, and you realise that it's very likely that terrorists will try and pervade the accreditation system in some way to get themselves a pass, because a pass to get you into the country and into the venue is a hugely valuable document for anyone who intends to cause us mischief. So that was a real intensive action to bring together all of the relevant parties, the police, the security agencies, Police Service in Northern Ireland. You guys in America were involved.
Why does that not surprise me?
Well, we wanted a little help from our friends. And
you may have gotten too much at some point.
You can get too much of that, yeah, because it was actually, I had to remind people that it was a UK Olympics. It wasn't a North America.
Yeah, very much.
A very significant influx of officers from other border agencies wanting to come over and, just keep an eye on us. But we managed that all well. But I think the key to all that was, that it took a lot of planning. I mean, he was doing this planning for 3 or 4 years before we get the operational stage, building relationships with other agencies and people, actually. And I was really lucky because, I was coming towards the end of my career, and I was always someone that was prepared to walk towards a problem. There's plenty of people in public service that will walk away from a problem and then point at you when it goes wrong. But I was always, and I thought, well, what the hell, I've only got 3 years to go anyway. The worst they can do is sack me, really. And I think my pension's pretty well in the bank. And I ran into a lot of other people like-minded to me who were sort of, senior police officers, senior security, senior military people who were like-minded, but we all had a passion for our country. And public service really mattered to all of us. And so we absolutely formed as a unit, and we were formidable in our capabilities across the board. So I'm very careful to point out when I say, yes, I'm pleased for what I did, but I was only part of a team. I'm pleased for what I did as my contribution, but I wasn't the only one that got a medal for what I did on the Olympics. There were a whole raft of people I have a huge amount of respect for, who also got recognised, because the key to success was that collaboration we spoke about earlier on, building those relationships with other people in different departments, between agencies. What could we share? What couldn't we share? How could we do this? How could you help in America? How could other countries, how could Europe help us? Because when you get down to that kind of level, nobody wants an Olympic Games to be blown up. No. Really. People will have different views on immigration and who should let in and how many should let in or not let people in, and immigration, and even customs to an extent, about what is permissible to come through a border and what checks should be done. But when you come down to security, national security, most people want things to be secure and expect there to be somebody somewhere behind the scenes, which we were. We were all very much behind the scenes. We were high profile stuff at the time. Nobody knew who we were, really. But there was an awful lot going on behind the scenes to make sure that this was a safe. And in the end, it worked well. I had to absolutely throw loads of resources at the borders, at the ports of entry. I had officers on overtime, on the subs bench. As soon as someone got a case, another one would be jumping in there to take over their desk. But we had a fantastic structure, pre-planned structure. I wasn't the most popular chap in the world. I had to cancel a lot of annual leave during the summer. People who wanted to go, maybe wanted to go to games, found themselves working on the border for me. But I mean, that's leadership. It's being able to get that buy-in, really, and to fend off opponents, and to sort of hold together for a long period of time a group of people that were absolutely passionate about the desired outcome. And when we did get the desired outcome, it was just a huge sigh of relief, really, from all of us, after the closing ceremony and everything, when we thought, deep breath, we did it. Because I must admit, there were times when we were really, really worried that something was going to happen.
This concludes the first part of my Pencast conversation with Mr. Tony Smith, CBE, former Director General of the UK Border Force, currently Managing Director of Fortinus Global Limited, and Chair of the International Border Management and Technologies Association, or IBMATA. Tune in soon for the next episode of our talk. Thank you.